Hello, human animal earthlings. It's great to have you joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you from Atlanta in March of 2026. I'm excited today that we're going to be talking about the importance, urgency, and hopefulness of wildlife habitat connectivity, based on the beautiful book Roam, Wild Animals and the Race to Repair Our Fractured World. And our guest is the book's author, Hillary Rosner, a well-published and award-winning nature journalist who also teaches journalism and science writing at the University of Colorado, working in the Center for Environmental Journalism. Her website is hillaryr.net. So R for Rosner, her last name, hillaryr.net. So if you want to hear stories about people helping wildlife roam freely between living spaces by taking down fences, letting waterways flow, and protecting their safe pathways, especially in the western and southern United States, then this is the In Tune to Nature show for you. Let me just tell you a bit about Hillary's book before we talk to her. Roam, Wild Animals and the Race to Repair Our Fractured World examines one of the most underreported environmental crises of our time: the global fragmentation of ecosystems and the barriers preventing wildlife from moving freely. Drawing on more than 200 interviews and reporting from landscapes across the US, Central America, Europe, and Africa, Rosner introduces scientists, farmers, dedicated volunteers, and other workers to restore wildlife corridors and reimagine human infrastructure. Her global reporting underscores the importance of wild animals being able to move freely and how man-made barriers like roads, fences, farms, and sprawl have gotten in the way. Roam is published by Patagonia Press in 2025 on 100% recycled paper and without any chlorine bleach. And I wanted to say that not enough presses do that, so thank you, Patagonia Press, for serving as an example of green publishing. Welcome, Hillary.
Thanks so much.
Hillary, I'm very excited to meet you and have you on the show because we both share an interest in writing books about equitably sharing our planet with other animals. And I'm still working on my own book about wildlife coexistence in America's park region. So I'm very inspired by your book, Roam, and your compelling writing style, like weaving together stories across so many countries and species, along with your own personal journeys through these urban and rural spaces. So I'm going to try to emulate you in that process. But I actually feel like I have a glimpse of how hard that is to do. Uh, I want to just commend you on your writing.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I can tell that this book is a collection of years of news reporting work and many trips around the world, meeting so many cool people. How did you get inspired to craft this book on wildlife connectivity?
Well, this is something that the broad topic of this book is something I've been thinking about and writing about for many years. And as I was reporting these stories about biodiversity issues all around the world, I kept noticing that the stories that really grabbed me in some way were about animals whose ability to move had been reduced because of something that we humans had done. And then back in 2018, a study came out that found that all over the world, in landscapes dominated by humans, species of mammals were moving less. It looked at
Hmm.
57 species of mammals and found that all across the world, in human-dominated landscapes, these animals were moving less. And I just thought that was so fascinating. And it kind of validated this thing that I had been thinking about and feeling, and just made me think that there was a book to write in here.
Yeah. Now, did you go around to Africa and Central America and different places and you were writing stories and then you're like, oh, I'm going to collect them all? Or was this like you pitched this to a publisher? I'm like, I'm going to go to all these places, but it just took you probably a few years to do it.
Yes, yeah. So it's the latter. I definitely drew on some reporting throughout
Yeah.
the book that I had already done for other stories, but almost all of the chapters are new reporting that
Ah,
I did for this book. And so, yes, I did pitch this to a publisher and said I want to go to these various places. Some of the places I knew right at the start. Some of the places I knew like the story that I wanted to tell. And then it was a question of trying to figure out where was the best place to go to tell that story.
okay.
And just on that note, I'll just say like these issues in the book about habitat fragmentation and how our human infrastructure works for humans, but makes it much harder for all these other species. And then these efforts by all kinds of wonderful people to try to knit the planet back together. These
Mm.
things I could have reported pretty much anywhere on the globe. Like there are these
Yeah.
stories everywhere.
Yeah.
And so it was really hard to to figure out like which stories to tell and where to go. And I also had to draw boundaries. So like there's not really much about water in this book
Right.
except for wetlands, which I think we're going to
Yeah, we're going
talk
to
about.
talk about that.
But
But yeah,
there's
you
nothing
weren't
about like
focusing on the
oceans or
fish or as
yeah,
much. Yeah,
right.
because you're
Because it just
overwhelmed with the
yeah, I
amount
had
of
to draw
species.
some kind of boundary.
Yeah. And can I just say that don't you agree that this book, Rome, is beautiful with all its photography of wild animals? It's a hardback square book for the our listeners. I'm kind of tapping on it right now. And it has like beautiful scenic pictures of landscapes and all these heroic people. Weren't you pretty happy with the fact it almost looks like a coffee table book of sorts, but it's not just pictures, it's all your storytelling, but it has more photos than a typical book has.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Patagonia did a really tremendous job
Yeah.
with it. I agree. It looks really beautiful. And I did not have anything to do with most of the pictures. They had this amazing photography department. I took a few of the pictures, but most of the pictures, I connected them to the right people and they kind of sourced all these amazing images.
Yeah. Well, what are some of your favorite images in the book?
Oh gosh. Oh my gosh, there's so many. I actually love some of the images from Florida. I know you wanted to
Yes,
talk about
yeah.
the Everglades, and I think some of the Everglades pictures are the most, really the most beautiful to
And a
me.
lot of them were taken by Carlton Ward Jr. I think he recently won a National Geographic award. And I had interviewed one of his colleagues for my book, but I never got to meet him. But I think he and his team, they wrote a book called Path of the Panther, and they do all these camera traps. I don't know if that's the right word, where you kind of hide cameras all around, and that's how they get the like the really awesome picture of the Florida panther in the water. And there was one of a bear, and he was going under like a barbed wire fence.
Yeah,
And because you wouldn't normally get those pictures if you were sitting there, the bear
right.
and the panther wouldn't even be around you. But you get these really fantastic kind of surprise pictures of animals.
Yeah, camera trap photos are so incredible. There's actually there's a photograph, I think in the book that is that I took of a screen of a camera trap. It's actually I was with these scientists in Italy and we were looking through a camera trap that they had put up and we were in the Alps and there was a picture of a wolf like that
Oh,
was had been standing right in the spot where I was standing and it was so amazing to think about because I knew that there were wolves moving through there,
yeah.
which is crazy to think about because Italy, you think about it being so densely populated, but I knew that there were wolves there and then to
You know,
see
they have
a
wolves
picture
and
of
bears. I
one.
mean, who would have thought? Yeah.
Yeah. So camera traps are really amazing.
Yeah, because like the wolf wouldn't is not going to be there at the time you're there, but
Right.
at nighttime and when the camera's there, you can get a nighttime shot,
Yeah,
of
exactly.
them moving through. And just even the picture that they picked for the main spread, which is a barbed wire that has somebody's fur or hair like all kind of stuck in the barbed wire. It's kind of up close. That really says a lot about like somebody either got kind of cut or caught trying to cross over the fence or they rubbed up against the fence and just had to leave and couldn't cross. And you don't know the story, but you see the fur and you just
Yeah.
know like this man-made barbed wire fence kind of got somebody and made making their life hard, which is like a
Yeah.
good symbol for how we for what's going on, yeah, in
Yeah,
the
I
book.
agree. I love that photo.
Well, to set us up, can you tell us the story of a particular animal species plight that helps capture the larger issue for you of why we should follow the biologist's urgent pleas to patch together remaining corridors of habitats or rewild corridors between habitats before it's too late as humanity's footprint expands across all terrains?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll give an example of elephants, just because
Yes.
that's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind. So I went to the chapter on elephants. I reported in northern Kenya, and I went to see these elephants that live in Samburu National Reserve. And these elephants, they migrate seasonally across this big landscape of northern Kenya, following available water and food supplies. And so I actually saw these elephants in Samburu National Reserve. And then I followed the route that they would soon be following as they were going to migrate out of the park. And we went to this place called Old Nero, which is kind of a crossroads. And it's this very important node on the elephant's route because it's where, because of like the contours of the landscape, essentially, like it kind of narrows and they have to go
Yes.
through this sort of like bottleneck.
Okay.
And this area of Old Nero is a rapidly developing place. And this is Kenya, so it's not rapidly developing the way we might think about it in the US. It's not like being paved over in strip malls. But what's happening there is that land that was community owned previously is being privatized. So now everyone is being given a kind of title to their parcel of land. And what they're doing is they're fencing it. So this is
Ah,
I now own this parcel of land and I'm going to build my house and I'm going to put up a fence for all the different reasons that people around the world might put up
yeah.
fences. And what's happening is these elephants are coming here following these migration routes that they have followed for centuries or even millennia. And now they are coming to this place and there's a fence there and they
Oh,
can't cross. And so they're having to look for other routes, but it's a relatively small
yeah.
area. And um, also in this same ecosystem, there are a lot of these erosion gullies that are opening. So it's kind of because of all different kinds of things, like the actual just geology of the landscape, grazing patterns, all different kinds of things. The rains come and sort of flood and open these cracks in the landscape, and then they get bigger over time. And some of them are big enough that you could like drive a car through them. And
Ugh.
so
They're kind of
as these
dangerous
yeah, so
to
as
go
these
through.
elephants arrive, they can't follow their historical routes anymore, and so they go looking for another route. But sometimes the only route is across these lands that are covered with these like giant gashes in the landscape. And so they have to find a way. They either have to go down into them and up the other side,
Ugh.
or jump over them, or go around them. And it's dangerous. Like they can fall
Especially
in
if they
sort of
have
the
babies with them, that might be
exactly.
impossible. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's just like that's kind of just a way to really illustrate what the problem is.
Yeah.
And so I went actually out there with this amazing man who works with Save the Elephants, and he is from this community.
Ah,
And so he is trying to work with the community members to say, hey, could you, before you put up your fence, could you think about putting it, 30 meters this way or 30
yeah.
meters that way so that we can keep this like even just a narrow corridor open for elephants? And
Right.
what that does is actually like it helps everybody because
Yeah.
you as a homeowner don't want an elephant kind of crashing through
Because
your fence and
they can
coming
knock
and
the fence over. I
yeah,
mean, they're
they
one of the
can. And
only animals who could. Yeah.
you don't want them, like hurting someone. You don't want them eating your garden. And so if you can just leave these corridors open, it actually like it kind of keeps the peace and allows everyone to
Yeah.
coexist.
Yeah. That is a great example just because us following our own individual instincts or what we need, we're not trying to hurt anyone else, but in the process, we inadvertently do that. And it's so if you don't have community-based planning for wildlife, and I do think the government or NGOs have to get involved in helping community members maybe rebuild their fences or even pay to do that or different kinds of things. The community has to create pathways for a variety, yeah, of animals. And if it's an afterthought in design, then it can be really expensive to retrofit. But if you from the beginning had thought about that, then yeah, you can build your community in a wildlife friendly way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right on so many levels. And I think, part of what I'm trying to do with this book is to just get us to shift our thinking slightly so that we are seeing the impact of these things that we are building to make our human lives easier, like seeing what the impact of those things is on all the other species that we share the planet with. And I think you're right. Like it's not like people are necessarily doing this, maliciously. It's just that we
Right.
tend to think about ourselves. But we have such a massive impact on the planet, on the surface of the planet that we have reshaped in all these different ways that makes life more convenient for us. But
Yes.
it actually has the opposite effect on most other species. And so I'm trying to just think about like, can we get people to shift their thinking a little bit? Like when we throw around this phrase bird's eye view, but like
Mm.
how often do we actually think about what that means? Like what does this world look like from the eye through the eyes of a bird? I've started
Yeah.
thinking about this a lot in my own backyard.
Yeah.
Like I have all these magpies who live around my yard and I try to think like, okay, well, what are they doing? What does this look like? Where's the food that they need and where's the water and how do they need to cross this landscape and what's in between the places that they need to go? And I think if we just can all shift our thinking a little bit, then maybe we will make better decisions from the get-go.
Yeah, I'm in my book, I'm trying to think about like, should I describe all these other animals as neighbors or residents or even Americans? Because my book is set in America, even though some of the animals migrate in and out. Like, or community members, like, who are they? But like, in many ways, they are neighbors, right? And so, what if we could just think about our neighbors, all of them, and what they need? And I love how you're talking about putting yourself in the perspective of the other animals, which is one of my questions I was asking in my book, to how often that people do that, and to make better if you do that, you end up making better decisions in your backyard or whatever design you have in your neighborhood for the birds and other animals there because you suddenly, took their perspective. Yeah,
Yeah,
I love
I
that.
love that idea about the neighbors. I was giving a talk this morning to some high school students in an environmental science class, and the
Awesome.
term stakeholder came up also. So we tend to think about stakeholders in any particular project or area as other humans, but like what if we started thinking about non-human species as stakeholders also?
Yes, like everything we do or everything we're designing should have that in it's like the environmental impact statements that we do in the United States for certain government projects. Like always be thinking about the environmental impact, including the stakeholders, as you mentioned, who are wild animals. So because yeah,
Yeah.
again, usually they're an afterthought or totally left out because we don't value them enough. But through books like yours, the Rome book, I'm hoping that also it increases people's respect for and thought for other animals.
Yeah, and just if I could just add one
Yeah.
more thing to that. Somebody was asking this morning at this presentation that I gave, I was talking about this reservoir, and someone was asking, well, didn't they have to have some kind of like environmental impact statement? And I said, well,
Mm.
what they just need to do is see like, are there endangered species there, right? Is there an endangered species that's going
Oh,
to be disturbed here?
that's
But
true.
there isn't, so we can go ahead with this project. But of course, like what's going to make those species endangered is
Yeah.
going ahead with this project because we do this project here, and then we do it here, and then we do it here. And then suddenly there is an endangered species, and it's the very one that wasn't endangered before when we decided that this project was
Yeah.
okay.
That's a great point that I wasn't really thinking about when I brought up the environmental impact statement, that a lot of times the wild animals are valued, especially from a government or policy perspective, are the ones who are already threatened or endangered. And so if you have a species whose population is relatively healthy, but we don't know how long it's going to be healthy, that doesn't mean they should be ignored just because they're a
Exactly.
common animal in that area. That's a great point. Well, okay, since my own book is focused on wildlife around Yellowstone National Park and Everglades National Park, those were the places I kind of went to straight in your book. So I wanted to focus on those chapters of your Rome book for our talk here. And I think it would interest our listeners, many of whom are in the United States, as we are. So let's start with your chapter on Wyoming's greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The chapter is called A Fence Runs Through It, How Fences Make Bad Neighbors. And you got to go out to Wyoming, and I think it was Cody, Wyoming, and it's around Yellowstone National Park, and remove some fences. Tell us about that experience and why people are removing fences.
Sure. I was actually blown away by the numbers. So across the American West, there's something like 600,000 miles of fencing. And that
This,
does not include property fences in cities and suburbs. So like my fence in my yard.
oh
That
my
is just
gosh.
fencing out on landscapes that we otherwise kind of think of as being wide open. So it's kind of this mind-blowing number. And I've always been struck by this when I've driven across the West, like
Yes.
in Wyoming or Montana, like these exactly the landscapes that we think of as being these like quintessentially Western big open landscapes are actually like crisscrossed by hundreds of thousands of miles of fences.
Yeah.
And so some of that fencing is necessary.
Yeah.
And some of that fencing is actually obsolete. So it's a fence that somebody put up decades ago, maybe a century ago, and it's no longer serving any purpose. But it is actually blocking routes that wild animals need to follow. And so, like you mentioned, that picture with the barbed wire fence and the animal hair, you know, a lot of these fences, some animals can cross over them, some animals can cross under them, and other animals can't. And they represent these barriers to movement. And either the animal, it's like a hard stop and it can't go, or it has to, expend a ton of energy trying to find a route, a break in the fence line or wherever the end of the fencing is.
Yeah.
And so I participated in this amazing volunteer work day where we took down some obsolete fencing. So this was on one rancher's habitat, one rancher's property, where they had some obsolete fencing. It's very expensive and labor intensive to remove this stuff. And so there may be lots of people who would love to remove this fencing, but they just don't have the resources to do it. And so this group called the Absarka Fence Initiative was organizing these volunteer days. And I think now, since then, there's actually like similar entities in different states that are organizing these
Great.
volunteer work days. And so I went out with, this was a relatively small one. There was maybe like 2 or 3 dozen people there. And we went out with like wire cutters and big thick gloves and we labored in the hot sun and
Yeah,
we
that's
kind of clipped the wire and took out the poles and sometimes like the fencing had grown around or sagebrush had grown up into the fencing and so you had to kind of pull this barbed wire from around this sagebrush. But it was incredibly satisfying. And
yeah.
at the end of the day, I think we had taken down a couple of miles of fencing.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
that was just in a few hours of the morning.
Amazing.
So it was really like something that you could do that you feel like, oh, I just made a concrete difference. And the ranch owner was so excited because she was talking about these elk, these like mama
Oh.
elk that came through this one area of the ranch with their babies and had to cross this fence line. And it was just kind of like very arduous for them. And now they had like this open pathway to get to where they needed to go for their food or water sources. So it was really cool to make a concrete difference by doing something like this.
And they also talked about like some designs of the fences that do exist where they can have the wire or barriers like be either higher or lower in places for the certain species can either step over the fence or get under it and not get caught in the middle
Exactly.
of the wire or something.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are definitely ways that you can make fencing in places where you need to have it. You can make it more wildlife friendly by exactly like having it sort of higher or lower or making it so that, say pronghorn can go under it or some other species can jump over it. But it's expensive.
Hmm.
And so it's something I think that that's often a barrier.
Yeah, again, I this makes me always feel like that our governments, whether it's federal or county or state or something, have to sometimes subsidize, or it would be great if they did subsidize these wildlife friendly designs. Just like if you really want people to have bear proof garbage cans, you might have to buy everybody a bear proof garbage can because if you don't, some people won't buy them and the bears will come into your neighborhood and then all these things will happen. The same might be true for fencing. Some people are going to go ahead and make that investment, other people aren't. And so it's going to be an odd patchwork of fences. So anyway, these are just ideas for people who work in government to, to think about like helping people do this. Also, you mentioned that there was like somebody who moved out there who built like this private fortress or mansion because also there's a tension between the people and I understand this from being out in that area too. So many people are moving out because of remote work now. They're moving out west and then like to these remote areas. And also that, that TV show Yellowstone with Kevin
Yeah.
Costner or whatever. So people are like, "Oh yeah, I want that kind of life." So they go out and apparently some guy you were mentioning had like built his own golf course community and had like 4 mile fence or something. It's like,
Yeah.
"What?"
Yeah, this is something that a lot of people were very concerned about, and people like on both sides of the political divide, right?
Yes.
So this was just something that people were very concerned with during this time, and I reported that chapter like back in 2021, so it was right after COVID, and this community in Cody in particular was just experiencing like this massive change. There were all these people from the coast who now could work remotely, who were coming in and wanted this kind of Western lifestyle, and really didn't understand the ecology of the
Yeah.
place that they were moving to. And so they were like a lot of the choicest home sites are in kind of valley bottoms, which is also exactly the migration routes that
Yes.
animals use. It's the land that we want, it's the land that animals need.
Right.
And then people putting up fences, not necessarily not trying to be malicious, but
Right.
just they bought this and they want to kind of put their fence up and not realizing that they've now just like blocked a wildlife corridor. When probably part of the reason what they moved there was to
Yes.
be closer to wildlife.
It's
And I saw
ironic.
this in
Yeah.
other places too. I saw this in Costa Rica too. I was doing reporting on the Osa Peninsula of Costa Rica, and I saw a similar thing. There were like Americans, wealthy Americans from California or wherever moving there and kind of building these properties where they wanted to be close to nature, but then they were putting up these giant walls and
Ah,
actually like serving as barriers to connectivity for wildlife.
yeah, that's where you really need the local developers or builders or community members to educate anybody that does come into the community to not be so ignorant when they're designing and building, their properties. But maybe their people are also just trying to make money, and so they'll do whatever the client wants. But yeah, that's really also sad to see. Or I remember out, this was kind of near Gardner, Montana, so on the top side of Yellowstone, that one of the people I was interviewing said like some neighbors that had moved in, I think they shot like a mountain lion or something just because the mountain lion was on their property. But like that's not, you don't move out here, build a big property and then get mad when there's wild animals like gonna cross your property. So it's again,
Yeah.
it's also the attitude, the ironic attitude that you want to be in nature, but you don't want any nature to be near you or interfere at all, or
Yeah.
or like
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
kind of make your mind up there. Let me reintroduce you. So, if anyone's just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature. I'm host Carrie Freeman, talking about the book Roam: Wild Animals and the Race to Repair Our Fractured World with its author Hillary Rosner, an award-winning journalist and University of Colorado faculty at the Center for Environmental Journalism. Her website is based on her name, Hillary Rosner, so it's Hillary R for Rosner, HillaryR.net. Oh, Hillary, I just wanted to also mention that when I was reading your book chapter that we're just talking about on the fences, and from my time out there near Yellowstone and Glacier National Park, it was reminding me of this documentary that I recently saw that I know is streaming online. It's about the Blackfeet Native American tribe. It's called Bring Them Home, about bringing back wild buffalo across their reservation. And the reservation is near Glacier National Park and the Canadian border in Montana. And the documentary describes the effects of the Dawes Act of 1887, which I don't think I had heard of or didn't remember, where it treated Native Americans as individuals rather than as members of tribes. So it ended up breaking up their communal living. And the new policy focused specifically on breaking up reservations and tribal lands by granting land allotments to individual Native Americans and encouraging them to take up agriculture. So this was over 100 years ago. But the documentary was saying that because of the Dawes Act, the Blackfeet members with land allotments as private property like built up fences, which they didn't used to do. And like a lot of them, again, were encouraged to raise crops or cows. And so the fences still exist today. And then that puts up physical and psychological and economic barriers to the tribe's larger goal of restoring their kinship and community with wild buffalo on the land. So it was just kind of reminding me that this human, more Western sense of individual property, especially with agriculture, it could be crops or farmed animals, the desire to kind of fence it off to protect it, your individual property, is an impediment to all the other animals who don't tend to do that beyond maybe their own little den or their little home. They don't take a whole area and put a big barrier so no one else can use it. So and that reminds
Yeah,
me
that,
almost of that story you told with the elephants at the beginning, where suddenly
yeah.
a communal area became individual, and then people started saying, "Oh, this is my property now, so I'm going to put a fence around it."
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly the same. That's just what I was thinking about when you were describing that.
Yeah, and so that's just something to think about. It's also the mindset that we have that isn't necessarily an indigenous mindset, but is more of a Western mindset that has permeated the world that humans have to own everything. And a lot of human groups originally did not have this viewpoint, and other animals don't have it. So we have to kind of be aware to work with that. And
Yeah,
before
and I
I,
mean,
oh, go
I
ahead.
just say if you think about, like migratory species who are, ones in particular who are going to be harmed by that kind of fencing, like we were talking about elephants or, different species across the American West, like it's also like previously migratory people, right? Nomadic people,
Yes. Yeah.
no longer can roam like that. And this causes like a whole cascading effect as well,
Right.
which is something that I saw in a different part of Kenya where these herders who um, used to be nomadic and now are kind of hemmed in and now there's like all these problems of overgrazing because they have much smaller areas in which to graze their animals and then there's conflicts with wildlife and encroachment on national parks and all these kinds of things.
Wow. Yeah, this can get us back into like discussions of, books we've read that are about how like the beginning of agriculture created more of a sedentary environment. So, and even that created wealth and inequality that we didn't used to have back when our ancestors were nomadic and like hunter-gatherers and wandered around. So just agriculture in general, creating cities and places where then we have property and we stay there and we build these fences, has changed
Yeah.
so many things. And it's interesting maybe that we don't move as much as we used to. And then now you're saying that study found that a lot of mammals don't move as much. The wild mammals, obviously our farmed animals don't get to move, but the wild animals now aren't moving. That's not their choice. It's because they're
Right.
having to deal with this whole new flow that, we've interrupted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so I also wanted to talk about the importance of water flows to wild animals who live in wetland areas like in South Florida, in and around Everglades National Park, and the tension between human housing developments and like the natural water that would be in these low-lying areas. And so you have a book chapter about it where you describe human neighborhoods wanting to divert water that was like flooding their streets and property. And they weren't thinking about how wading birds and kind of other nearby areas and the fish depended on these waters and the way that the seasons in Florida have shifting water levels of like times where it's drier and times where it's wetter. And like, again, the humans just weren't maybe thinking about that. So they do something for themselves and then it kind of screws up the other individuals trying to survive there. Can you
Yeah.
discuss that?
Yeah, so in the book, I tried to think about this word connectivity. I tried to look at a lot of different kinds of connectivity, and so this was an attempt to think about hidden connectivity. So
Mm.
how can we think about ways that systems are connected that we can't see? And wetlands are a great way to think about that because, of course, like there's all this water flowing underground that we cannot see and these hidden connections. So if you have a community over here which wants to like drain the wetlands and build houses and schools and roads and everything, um, that is actually having an impact. On the other hand, like over there, where you might still have these wetlands that seem to be intact, like visibly to our
Yeah.
human eye, the wetland is still there. But in fact, because you've drained this other system, you've actually completely altered the way water flows through that wetland. And so it's not intact at all. And I became really fascinated by this idea. And so I went to visit an Audubon preserve there called the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, which is in the Western Everglades, which is having all these problems because even though they have done so much to protect this particular area, they're having their water is changing, their flow of water is changing because of communities nearby that are trying to stop their driveways and lawns and things from flooding. And so it's actually changed the way water flows through the system in the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. And so different pools of water are no longer like full at the same time frames that they always used to be. And there's different kinds of birds that rely on these wetlands at different times of year when they're at different levels. And so when you change the water levels and the timing, even by like a really, really small amount of either small amount of time or small amount of water level, you're completely altering the food webs in this system.
Yeah, I was fascinated. to hear about that when you were describing certain birds like the roseate spoonbill, and I can't remember the other birds have different ways that they fish, and like if it gets dry and then so the puddles of water are smaller and then the fish collect in them, it really works to the advantage of a lot of birds, obviously not to the fish, but to the
Yeah.
birds. But then if it's not dry for as long as it needs to be, then the birds who are migrating through and they expect that fish to be available to them while they're there, suddenly, even if it's off by like a few weeks, it messes up their migration. And these are just things, again, that the developers or stuff are being ignorant to, but should not be allowed to be ignorant to the how delicate this system is, this web. And then because then there's other times where it's kind of the water is very high and overflowing, and then the fish aren't as collected, but there's different animals that operate in that environment.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So some of these birds are like feed by sight, so they need to be able to see the fish, and then some of them actually feed by feel, so they actually need to be able to feel the fish. And so they need different kinds of water levels where the fish are more or less concentrated depending on
Yeah.
what they need. And then you also have like different, that like that impacts different things. So there's other species that maybe rely on occasionally eating like scraps of food that fall out of a bird's nest. And now, like, if you take that bird away, you take that species away. And
Yeah,
yeah,
maybe
so
the
it's like,
alligator. You had there was a picture of an alligator in there, and you talked about how they can be in a symbiotic relationship by protecting some of the birds' nests, I think from raccoons or whatever who
yeah,
might.
exactly,
But
exactly.
then if anybody falls out of the bird's nest, they're probably going to eat them. But so, so yeah, all these animals kind of work together. And I was just also excited because I used to live when I was in my 20s, I lived in Fort Myers, Florida, and so that's like not far
Yeah,
from there. And
right
honestly,
over
when
there.
you live down there in a peninsula, you're kind of stuck and there's not anywhere to go when you live in South Florida. So you go to every like park, you go to every natural place. So me and my late husband had gone on nature walks many times in that Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary.
Oh, right,
But it's
great.
possible that back in that was like in the 1990s that those subdivisions that you were showing might not have been there. But I did look at them on the aerial maps that we have access to on the internet because you were mentioning that, and there was a picture in your book of a really heavily developed area right smack next to a completely wild the Corkscrew Sanctuary. So it is really fascinating, and our listeners might want to do this to just go and look at South Florida or any area and just zoom in on these satellite images from the maps and just kind of look at how hemmed in by various developments this Corkscrew Sanctuary is. Because it should be feeding like that, like the National Panther refuge, the Florida Panther refuge is really not that far from there, and it should be able to have connectivity. But because now there's different houses along Immokalee Road and all this stuff, some of that whole big Cypress, Everglades, panther habitat that could connect up, into the Corkscrew Sanctuary is just now has to you have to deal with roads and subdivisions and different kinds of things.
Yeah, and of
Uh,
course, this all ties back to kind of the history of South Florida to begin with, which was, I mean, the Everglades was just this like unbelievably spectacular, massive, like the biggest wetland ecosystem on Earth, I think, just this incredible system that humans over time like drained and destroyed and turned into cities and sugarcane plantations, and just it was like a multi-century effort to try to figure out how to reclaim this land. And of course, in doing that, we shrunk the Everglades to like this tiny fraction of what it used to be, and
oh
um,
man. Yeah,
changed
it
all
is
these
a
systems. Sorry, not to horribly
Oh
depress
yeah, it
people.
is a fascinating place. And of all the UNESCO World Heritage sites I'm looking at in my book, the only one that's threatened on the UNESCO list is the Everglades because of all the hydrology that's all messed up by the canals
Yeah.
and the roads and everything. But I will say there's a lot of investment, being put into trying to rectify this massive problem, but they can't completely undo these things. And now people are driving across, but they are trying to do like overpasses and
Yes.
underpasses so they are working a lot on it, but also you have like I don't know, I forgot you might have had it in here, but I heard other people say that it might be like 1,000 people a day moving into Florida. Like people are just
Yeah.
flocking to Florida and then they're
Yeah.
pushing into Central Florida, which is really the last part of Florida that's really wild. And that's like, because that's where the Corkscrew Sanctuary is. It's more in central southern Florida. And
Yeah.
that never traditionally had all these like dense golf course communities, is kind of what I
Yeah.
would refer to them as. We're gonna need to wrap up in a minute, but I wanted to just ask you about birds and bats briefly because also it's interesting that they're in your book. We were just talking about wading birds, but for the birds that are like more of the high flyers or bats, people might think, oh, well, what barriers do we put up for them? I mean, they can go anywhere. Like, what's the problem? So, what was it if you want to tell us about a bat or a bird? Like, what were some ways that we need to help them roam?
Sure. Yeah. So I was really interested in writing about a species that flies because we don't, like you're saying, it's very easy to grasp the concept of connectivity with terrestrial species.
Yeah.
But species that fly through the air, well, like there's no border wall in the air,
Right.
there's no interstate highway blocking them. But of course, those flying species have to come down to the ground all along their journey to access food or to find a mate or to nest and rest and all of these kinds of things. And so, in fact, flying species, especially migratory ones that traverse long routes, really, really need our help in terms
Yeah.
of maintaining that connectivity so that they can come down and access what they need all along the way. And so I have a chapter about a migratory bat that is a nectar feeding bat, and it migrates between northern Mexico and the southwestern United States and feeds on agave nectar all along the way. It kind of like surfs this agave highway, is the way I
Yummy.
describe it. And unfortunately, these agave landscapes are threatened and vanishing for all the same reasons that everything else is, development, cities and roads and industrial agriculture and all the rest. And so I went with some people from Bat Conservation International, which is this conservation group, to visit these desert communities in northern Mexico where the people are also struggling. They've historically lived there and farmed and ranched, and now because of increasing drought, it's much harder for them to do that. And so Bat Conservation International is providing them with kind of new ways to make a living. So in some cases, they were helping the women in these communities make like natural products like lotions and things that they could
Oh,
then sell in the bigger cities. And so they
yeah.
were providing them with tools to make those products. And in exchange, the people in these communities are growing agaves and planting them out in the landscape to try to rebuild these agave highways for the bats.
Oh,
And so it
agave
was,
highway. I like that. I like that term. That gives us something to work with. Like that they
yeah,
need these they're like spots that they have to refuel. And the
yeah,
more we take
exactly.
that away, they literally cannot migrate because they
Yeah,
can't
because they don't have
refuel.
anything to eat along the way. Yeah. So that was just like a really
Yeah.
amazing way to sort of visualize this. And also, I just love that it was like such a win-win. It was a win for these communities who
Yeah.
got to stay in their habitats or in their, on their farms that they've
Yeah.
lived in for centuries. And then it was also a way to connect them to these bats and to help the bats continue to be able to make their journeys.
Yeah, I love the idea of if we can like rewild a place, if we want to use that term, and then but somehow make it economically feasible for the community. I don't know if it's through tourism or like like using the plant products like you mentioned. That is a win-win if we have rewilding as part of what we're working on. Well, Hillary, to wrap up, for any of our listeners who are inspired by the stories in your book, Roam, and want to get involved in wildlife habitat connectivity efforts, what are your suggestions for them to get started, like either in their communities or through nonprofit organizations they could join?
Well, to start with, if you go to the book's product page at Patagonia and you scroll down, there's actually a list of resources
Okay.
that you can access, and it gives you the websites for all of the different nonprofits and different labs and groups and things that I wrote about in the book. So you
Okay.
could kind of connect up with any of them that way. Also, I just think trying to think about like what lives where I live and how can I get involved. And sometimes it's as simple as like getting involved in your county, like maybe there's a kind of trail reforestation effort
Yeah.
or some kind of, like you mentioned, rewilding, or maybe there's some kind of like habitat restoration work in your community that's going on that you can participate in. There might also be things that you can do just in your own backyard if you live in a place that has a backyard, right? So there's
Yeah.
lots of pollinator species that
Mm.
need to move through. They need corridors as well. They need all kinds of flowers and plants that they can use as food, and that helps pollinate our plants. And so maybe it's just a question of like thinking like, do I need this lawn? And could I replace it with
Yes.
some kind of pollinator friendly habitat? Or what can I do to protect the species that I already know are here and can see in my own backyard? Again, if you have a yard and you're in a situation where you can actually change it. But yeah, I think like part of what I'm hoping that people will do is just start noticing things differently.
Yes.
So like what lives where I live, and what does it need, and like what happens even if it's just a small, like a squirrel in your yard or something. That's a great starting point. Like, where
Yeah.
does this squirrel live? Where is its home? Where's its nest? What is it eating? And where does it need to go to get what it needs, just in its daily life? And so that might just be a starting point, because once you start thinking about that, you might notice the other creatures that are living, or using the same resources as that squirrel, and then it might lead you to sort of think, further up the food chain, or just about other species.
When you talked about the agave highway, I always see what I call squirrel highways, which are trees. Like I love it when you have trees so big in a residential neighborhood that the squirrels can cross over the street via the branches of trees, because otherwise they end up getting killed by our cars on the street, you know? So I'm like, yeah, we just need more trees that are near other trees so that, they can get across. So,
Yeah,
yeah, if you just pay attention and when trees come down, you can recognize that, and they sometimes they just come down because of storms or other things, that we have to constantly replant trees so that they
yeah,
don't lose their access that they used to have to these different things. But yeah, I love that advice of just paying attention to who is around us and where they're going and the things that we're doing that could potentially um, make more way a path for them, a natural path.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe think about like, I don't know what is, on the ballot where you live. Like, maybe there's some potential development or issue that's going
Yeah.
to impact other species, and perhaps you could start seeing like all of our human infrastructure and development through
Yeah,
the
the
lens of other
roads.
species. And then maybe there's a way that you can get involved in advocating for a wildlife overpass over a highway or
Yes.
something like that where you live.
I love that idea. Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Hillary Rosner, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. Thanks for the work you've done over the years as a science journalist, helping people understand wildlife issues and how to be part of the solution. And thank you for collecting these stories and ideas in this compelling and beautiful book, Roam.
Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. I record from Atlanta in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the Muskogee Creek Territory and former range of the red wolf, now home to groups of coyote families and a million pigeons, chipmunks, and squirrels. You can access action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, wrfg.org/intune to nature, or on our Facebook page. The views and opinions expressed on In Tune to Nature do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species who need the freedom to survive, thrive, and roam across our planet. Thank you for listening. Cheers.